Does lowering the stack opening on your offset smoker with a cake pan help you cook better barbecue? We're gonna find out in this video, so let's get smoking. Welcome to the Smoke Lab, I'm Steve Gow, and on this show I do crazy barbecue experiments you would never do at home so you can learn from my trial and error. Lowering your stack opening, why in the world would we want to do that? Well, one argument for doing it is that when your exhaust opening is up too high, then all of the hot air from the firebox just goes up and over your meat, and it provides a much easier path for the hot air to escape up and over your meat and not directly on it where it needs to be. Now, by changing the position of the stack opening, we change the thermodynamics of the smoker, and we force that hot air back down and over top of your meat to exit the stack. And theoretically, that will even out cook chamber temperatures, it'll cook your meat more evenly, and it will also render the fat caps on your meat more effectively. Let's look at a model to better visualize how that might work. In our first model smoker here, you can see that the red fluid, we'll say that's the hot air from the firebox. Hot air behaves much like a liquid, but unlike a liquid, it doesn't flow down because it's more buoyant than cold air, so it prefers to flow up instead of down like a liquid. Now that hot air, it's flowing into the cook chamber from the firebox and out of the stack. Actually, let's flip this around so it looks more like what hot air actually does. The hot air is moving through the top of the cook chamber in a thin layer and right out the stack at the top, and not much of it is getting to the meat down lower in the cook chamber. Now let's lower the stack so the opening is right in the middle at grate level where your meat is. You can see how the hot air now has to fill almost half of the cook chamber before it can escape out of the stack opening. That means the hot air is getting pushed lower into the cook chamber and more of your meat is submerged, which theoretically should result in more even cooking temperatures left to right, more even cooking temperatures of the meat itself, and faster cooking because the meat is in more of the heat. Okay, that's a lot of great theory, but now we have to test it in real life. So for this test, we'll be cooking a whole pork belly that I'll cut in half. One half of the test without the cake pan, and one half I'll use with the cake pan installed and the stack lowered. And we'll collect temperature data at multiple different points in the smoker, but we'll also see if there's a difference in the fat cap rendering on top of the pork bellies. First, I'm slathering the bottom of each belly with soy sauce as a binder to add a base layer of flavor. Then I'm seasoning it with my Let's Gow general purpose barbecue rub. That's going on in a pretty thick layer. Then I'm adding a layer of Oklahoma Joe's Carolina style barbecue rub. That's going on as a final layer. And then I'm flipping the bellies over and I'm repeating the same thing. More soy sauce, more Let's Gow, and more Carolina rub. And then we're good to go. Looking tasty. Next, I'm lighting up my Oklahoma Joe's Longhorn offset smoker with my Oklahoma Joe's charcoal lighter, and then I'm placing the control pork belly into the smoker fat side up. This is the test with the stack in its regular location at the top left of the smoker. I've got a probe measuring the temperature at the top of the cook chamber, one at grate level, which is where I normally take my temperature from, and one below grate level underneath the meat. Then I have another probe way at the back below the stack opening. We'll close that up and cook away at 315 degrees, nice and hot, for 3 hours. While it's cooking, I used my IR camera, and you can see how much of the heat is concentrated at the top of the cook chamber and also over here by the stack opening. And most importantly, if we look at the very back of the smoker, you can see the hot yellow area doesn't quite make it to the midpoint of the smoker where the handle is. Keep that in mind for later. Now I'm probing the belly, and it's 145 in some spots, 165 in others. Normally, I'd keep going until the fat cap is really well rendered and squishy and brown and caramelized, and you can almost poke your finger straight through it and there's no bounce back. But I want to cook each pork belly for exactly 3 hours at 315 degrees Fahrenheit for this test and compare the different rendering levels. Okay, moving on to the next test, we need to install the cake pan exhaust now, so we're gonna do it quick and dirty. The cake pan doesn't fit in as it is, so we need to cut it down. It's 9 inches from the top of the exhaust opening to grate level. So I measured 9 inches down from the top of the cake pan, made a line, cut it off with an angle grinder. Then I cut a semicircle out of the bottom of the cake pan, which will be our new exhaust opening at grate level. Will it fit though? Yes, actually, like a glove, but it's kind of loose, so we need some way to fix it to the smoker. Now you could drill holes in the cake pan and through your smoker and secure it with some nuts and bolts, but this is a temporary experiment. So I'm taking some dough, i.e. flour and water, and putting it on the edge of the cake pan. Then I simply stick it in place against the wall of the smoker, covering the exhaust and bringing it down to grate level. And then the heat of the smoker is going to harden that dough and seal it against the smoker wall, which forms a temporary gasket that I can easily remove later. This is actually an old distiller's trick. I used to distill my own alcohol and brew my own beer, and in my still, it had holes in it in some areas, so I had to plug them up with dough, and the heat from the still hardens it and makes a airtight seal. So I found that it's very useful in smoking situations where I drill a lot of holes in my smoker and I just patch them over with some dough, which is temporary, it's food safe, and it works really well. Now, the experimental belly goes on the smoker, and I'm going to cook it at 315 degrees for 3 hours. I used my IR camera again, and most of the heat is up at the top of the cook chamber like before, but if we look at the very back of the smoker, we can now see that the hot yellow area and orange area is extending much further down the smoker below the midpoint. Interesting. Okay, now taking a look at the experimental belly, the fat cap feels much more rendered and squishy than the previous test, and it's probing at 175 to 185 degrees after 3 hours, whereas the previous pork belly was only at around 145 to 165 at this point. Again, very interesting. Now this pork belly is getting wrapped like the other one and also finished in the oven. Now, to finish off this recipe and turn these bellies into actual edible barbecue products that my family will eat, I'm taking the belly and slicing it into cubes. You can see the amount of fat rendering on the control brisket here, not a lot. Then I'm slathering them in some Texas rib candy. It's the grape cherry flavor that isn't super spicy. It's too spicy for me. No, my kids just don't like super spicy stuff, so I just tone it down a little bit. Then they go back on the smoker for 30 minutes for the sauce to tack up, and right before I serve them, I put a little more rib candy glaze on them. By the way, you can use any barbecue sauce you want. I just like this stuff. The control pork belly burnt ends looked like this, nice and squishy, and although they didn't have a ton of brown caramel colored fat rendering on the top, they were super soft and delicious, and I would feed them to anybody. But the cake pan burnt ends, i.e. the pork belly that we cooked with the lowered stack, it was phenomenally good. It was out of this world. They had so much more fat rendering, and they almost tasted like biting into a toasted marshmallow over a campfire, but it's filled with pork and fat instead of sugar. It was so good, and it was one of the best bites of barbecue I've cooked in a long time. Now, taking a look at the temperature data, the first big thing to note is I kind of screwed up a little bit here. I was controlling the temperature based on the grate level reading, and it turns out I ran the experimental cake pan test around 15 degrees hotter on average, after I crunched all the numbers, than the control test. Not a huge difference. I mean, when I'm smoking on my offset smoker, I'm usually plus or minus at least 15 degrees Fahrenheit, so I don't think that's a really big deal, and I don't think 15 degrees is enough to account for the extreme difference in the fat cap rendering and the increased cook speed of the cake pan test. It was at 185 degrees after 3 hours, whereas the control test was only at 145 to 165. So it got a lot more heat, and 15 degrees doesn't really account for all of that extra heat. But assuming that 15 degrees of error made all the difference, let's look what happens when I adjust all the temperature differences by 15 degrees. So the grate level temperatures are now the same and everything else is adjusted by 15. Well, now the top of the cook chamber is 13 degrees lower in the lowered stack test, which I think suggests that the hot air is being pushed lower because it's less concentrated at the top of the cook chamber, and it's less hot up there because the temperature gradient is being pushed down. And below grate level is 4 degrees hotter, also suggesting that the convection currents are being pushed down. There's more heat underneath the meat. And by the far left of the stack opening is 18 degrees hotter with the stack at grate level, which also supports the theory that the convection current is being pushed down, and there's more hot air enveloping the brisket on all sides now. So there are some issues with this data, but I still think that it supports the hypothesis that lowering the stack to grate level results in more even cooking of the meat because there's more hot air enveloping the meat in total, and it pushes the convection currents down in the cook chamber, which helps the meat cook more evenly and faster and get better fat cap rendering. As an aside, I've also done this same test on a larger offset where I physically took an angle grinder to the stack, moved it to grate level, welded it back on, and I tested both before and after doing that, and I found very similar results. So I'm pretty confident that lowering the stack to grate level is actually doing something. But should you do this mod and lower your stack to grate level with a cake pan? I think it's an excellent mod to try. It's really inexpensive. The cost of a cake pan is super low. All you need is an angle grinder to cut it in half. A lot of people already have that. You could also use a hacksaw if you wanted to. It'll just take a little bit longer. And you can just attach it with some dough to see if you like it and just remove it if you don't. If you do like it, you can permanently install it by just drilling some bolt holes in and bolting it to the side of the smoker, and boom, you've lowered your stack to grate level. And unlike some other mods like the dryer elbow vent mod, this doesn't take away a lot of cooking surface because the cake pan is much closer to the wall of the smoker. The difference is very noticeable in my opinion, but I'm interested in your opinion. Will you try this mod? Do you think that lowering the stack to grate level will actually make a difference for you? Let me know in the comments section below, and definitely let me know if you have any ideas for future Smoke Lab videos. I will see you in the next one, and until next time, happy smoking.